All right, so we're moving ever closer to the actual day. We're moving ever closer to the actual events of Pearl Harbor, because today we're taking a look at Part 5 of Extra History's series on the lead up, the road to Pearl Harbor. They call it the Path to Pearl Harbor. But we are specifically looking at their episode Climb Mount Nataka today, and the next one will be the actual day of infamy, the actual events of Pearl Harbor. But that also means we're coming up to the end here. So I'm going to remind you again, as we get closer and closer to the end of this series, please make sure that you put any suggestions, any ideas, anything that you want to see happen going forward in the comments so that I can kind of get that prepped, get that put together. I'm starting a playlist of things that I'm going to watch and react to. I've already been recommended some Kings and Generals. I've been recommended a few different things. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get rolling and see what we've got here with Climb Mount Tanaka. I keep wanting to say Tanaka. It is Nitaka. But let's go ahead and get rolling.
Tokyo, November 5th, 1941, midnight. Saburo Kurusu quietly sits on his bed. Despite his caution, his wife Alice, an American who Kurusu met on assignment there, wakes. "I'm going to the United States, probably," Kurusu says. "When?" replies Alice. "Morning." He explains that American Ambassador Grew has called in a favor to delay a Pan Am flight out of Hong Kong so Kurusu could make it via naval plane. He is to be a special envoy delivering a peace proposal to Roosevelt. It's cold. Alice wraps a blanket around him. This mission will be a dangerous one. Militarists had plotted to assassinate Prime Minister Konoye due to his peace platform, and one diplomat had already been murdered for getting too close to Grew. So they decide their son, an army engineer, will ride the train with him. That way, reporters would think that Kurusu was seeing him off on a deployment. And the next morning, the two head out together, with Japan's last hope for peace sitting in Kurusu's briefcase.
The militarists were so used to using violence to get their way. The militarist movement, in part, began with a series of assassinations for individuals who were opposed to military expansion and opposed to imperialism within Japan and its government. The former prime minister was gunned down in the early 30s. Waiting for a train. And a number of people were killed by army and naval officers. And eventually those individuals went on trial. And in kind of the same vein as why the United States never actually put Confederate leadership on trial after the Civil War, they used that platform to preach this militarist, imperialist, expansionist ideology and the fact that they had lost their warrior spirit and they'd lost their way since the modernization of the Meiji period and the focus more on a democratic government. So I'm not particularly surprised to hear that there had been a plan to kill Konoe, and I can 100% understand why somebody would be fearful to go and do this. And to a lot of militarists, they probably see this envoy specifically as a traitor, given that they are married to an American woman, where a lot of militarists see the United States as kind of the big bad boogeyman that had limited them in the 20s with things like the Washington Naval Treaty. Let's see where this goes.
Thanks so much to GiveWell for not only helping everyone find highly effective charities, but also making sure that our donation dollars go further. The appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister seemed to put Japan on an inevitable path to war.
Don't forget that. We left off with Konoe actually stepping down because he knew that the military wanted this fight, and he knew that it would be disastrous for Japan. Pretty much anybody who was outside of that militarist echo chamber knew that Japan's war in China was not going well, and knew that even if they could win a series of battles in Southeast Asia, they couldn't really maintain that long term if the United States were to get involved in the war, which is kind of a problematic prospect either way. The U.S. isn't directly stating one way or the other because they don't want to sway or don't want to make it appear that they are preparing for conflict with Japan, because they're concerned with what's going on in Europe, where American vessels are already being sunk in the Atlantic during the Battle of the Atlantic. And now we've got this buildup, this issue of maybe we can work out a peace. But realistically, by the time that Hideki Tojo takes over as prime minister, it's done. It's never going to work out in that manner. Tojo was the lead militarist. He had every expectation that they were going to be able to turn things around in China, and that the only way to do that was with further expansion in the southeast. There's a reason why Hideki Tojo is one of the individuals who is hung in the Tokyo trials after World War II, is because of his support for the Japanese army in their war crimes in China and his insistence on expanding the conflict throughout this period.
But ironically, behind the scenes, it was the peace faction that considered him the best candidate. After all, even if a diplomatic solution could be found, the new prime minister would need to be somebody with military pull.
And that's a fair point. Up to this point, one of the big reasons why the military has refused to agree or work with the civilian government is because they don't trust that the civilian government is actually caring about the military. Going back to that Taisho constitution that literally separates the two factions, the military and the civilian government, which has kind of led to the snowball of problems where the military can just kind of get away with their ignoring and double-crossing of diplomatic deals made by the civilian government, which made the whole nation look untrustworthy and problematic.
Need to get the army on board with any agreement, and probably put down riots and attempted coups after the announcement of said agreement. And shockingly, it appeared they were right. Tojo himself was stunned by the appointment, and once in office, the enormity of Japan's predicament hit him. He now represented the whole country, and realized how dubious the Navy was about whether they could win a war with the US. So at a series of high-level meetings in November, he reopened the question of a diplomatic solution. What could be done? Are we even sure we can win a war? What will be the consequences? He even proposed revisiting the decision from the Imperial Conference of September 6th, laying out that if diplomatic efforts failed, war would be declared on America, Britain, and the Netherlands. This was unbelievable. Reversing an imperial decision was unprecedented in Japanese history. These contentious meetings lasted for up to 14 hours at a time. Several civilian leaders even suggested a war would be so devastating, it would actually be preferable for Japan to accept a time of economic hardship and humiliation rather than fight one. Though army leaders shot back quick, saying the country was already rationing and food prices spiking due to the American embargo.
This is actually something I didn't know this. I've never heard about the kind of second guessing of Tojo. From everything that I'd read, it always sounded like he was directly prepared for this conflict and wanted it. And that's kind of the big idea of being able to see so many different sources and be able to watch and kind of take in videos like this, being able to actually hear the differing sides of this. If one thing's very true that we've seen throughout this series, through my comments and through theirs, nothing is ever black and white. It's never as simple as they cut off our oil, we're going to war. Or the Japanese attacked us out of nowhere because they wanted to take over British colonies. Which I feel like are a lot of the very simple takeaways from the build-up to Pearl Harbor. And there's a few reasons why I think we get there. For instance, I'm a high school history teacher. There's not a lot of time to get into the nitty-gritty. A lot of teachers, by necessity, teach just the broad strokes. Teach Japan's expanding in East Asia, and the U.S. cuts off their oil because of that, so Japan attacks. We don't have in the classroom, time to go into all of this deeper context and structure. And that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to start reacting to videos in general, was to be able to actually discuss that deeper context. Something that I can't do in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. So this is actually really interesting, seeing Tojo have that kind of second thought about this war with the United States. But let's move on.
Better to declare war and have a small chance of victory than to accept the conditions of defeat without even fighting. But finally, Tojo and his new foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, emerged with a last-ditch effort for peace. They would make 2 proposals to Roosevelt.
I'm very interested in this, because like I said, I'd never heard about a Tojo peace plan. So I'm interested to see the 2 options that they were provided to Roosevelt.
Proposal A and Proposal B. In Proposal A, Japan would agree to negotiate an end to the Sino-Japanese War, make an initial troop drawdown, and withdraw all troops from China over a 25-year period.
Okay, so this is one of the big things the U.S. is looking for. They want the war in China to end. For the last several decades before this, China had been a big trade partner with the United States. We'd been a major player in their politics from the open door policy, the open door letters, the work of Secretary of State John Hay, and the progress and the attempts to keep China from going the imperialized, broken down route that Africa and South Asia had gone under the new colonial age. So the United States wants China to regain its independence and back out. And this initial promise of troops being pulled out of China and a gradual reduction over the next 25 years, it's not perfect, but I understand what they're trying to get at. They're proposing and saying, hey, we're going to get there. We can't pull out entirely because we are going to have riots and rebellions given how long we've been there and the efforts that we've made. So we'll put a 25-year timeline in. And my assumption would be that they would gradually back away from the southern line that they had with Chiang's forces. But that's pure conjecture. But this is a lot of the same things that the U.S. had asked for initially. They had not asked for a 25-year timeline. I'm sure the U.S. wanted to be done much quicker than that. But, so that's plan A.
And in Proposal B, Japan would immediately reverse its troop movements to the southern portion of Indochina, freeze military deployments in Southeast Asia, and pledge to remove all troops from Indochina once the war in China was concluded.
Okay, so this is kind of a further... It's very much so in the same vein. It's looking at the fact that the big thing that actually triggered those embargoes wasn't the war in China itself, isn't that second Sino-Japanese war, but instead the invasion of French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, which, by the way, at this point, are already seeing guerrilla fighters across that region. We often forget about it, but a lot of the same leaders that are eventually going to fight against the French in Vietnam's fight for independence after the war, and eventually a lot of the same leaders that are going to fight against the United States in the Vietnam War actually get their start in this insurgency against Japanese forces during World War II after their initial invasion. So this reversal, we're going to pull back out of southern Indochina, we're going to back off of Malaya, and these other regions. Now, the U.S. doesn't know that they're about to invade those other regions, but they know that they're building up a lot of troops in French Indochina, which is perfectly structured to then bounce off attacks into, say, the American-held Philippines and Guam, down into the Dutch East Indies, what is today Indonesia, the English colonies in Malaysia. So this makes perfect sense as an alternative. And those two things together has to be a really appealing peace proposal to Roosevelt if he gets it. But I don't know if he's going to, given the militarist track record with dealing with diplomats that are pro-peace. So we'll see where that goes. But
In return, America would end its aid to nationalist China, sell Japan oil, and broker trade agreements for rubber and other materials.
And that might be the breaking point here. Not so much the oil and rubber. That could definitely be functional with the removal of troops from French Indochina. But that removal of aid to Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, that's probably a non-starter for the United States at this point. Right? Because once that they cut off aid, realistically, the Japanese can start starving out the Chinese forces.
Of course, they had greater hopes for Proposal B, since it was more concrete, immediate, and managed to avoid the thorny issue of China. The plan was to give Roosevelt Proposal A, then if it was declined, present Proposal B, and if both were turned down, it would be war. The military pressed for a new deadline, a date after which diplomacy was considered to have failed. Tojo managed to haggle almost a month out of them. So on November 5th, as Kurusu boarded his train, Tojo and his ministers sat down with Emperor Hirohito for a new imperial conference. They outlined the proposals, the dire costs of the American embargo, and the proposed attack on Pearl Harbor. The emperor gave his assent. If peace was not found by December 1st, the attack would go ahead. The next day, when Nomura presented Proposal A to Secretary of State Hull, he found him unenthusiastic. That was pretty much expected. What wasn't expected, however, was that Hull and Roosevelt would take until November 14th to formally turn it down. So much later than anticipated, Nomura and Kurusu tried Proposal B. What they didn't know at that juncture, however, was that Hull already knew about this alternate proposal. Because over at the Magic program, its staff of military officers and code-breaking women, known as Code Girls, had already intercepted and deciphered the proposals when they were sent to Nomura via the Purple Code. So not only had Hull read both proposals, but he also read the government's instructions to Nomura about how to present them, which rubbed him the wrong way. See, while the Magic program was good at cracking Japanese codes, they were bad at translation.
And that's a big issue throughout time. Communication has always been kind of the bane of the existence of good diplomacy. Throughout history, just the reality of different cultural norms and structures could completely doom a negotiation before it ever really starts. And English to Japanese was not an easy process. And a program like that, the United States at this point probably wouldn't have allowed Japanese Americans into that program. As we ended up seeing during World War II, the United States was very wary of first and second Japanese generation Japanese Americans, Nisei. And states like California had openly racial policies. We always talk about the Jim Crow laws of the South, but for a period of time, California had very strict exclusionary and segregationist laws against Asian Americans, Chinese and Japanese specifically. And this was a big deal, around the turn of the century. But the U.S. government hadn't really stepped away from that. And as a result, I wouldn't be surprised if native Japanese speakers or individuals who had learned it directly in the home, like the Nisei, the first generation Americans of Japanese descent, would just not be allowed into a program like this. And I'm sure that very much so hurt their ability to translate these codes properly.
The program was underfunded, understaffed, and had no native Japanese speakers. And because diplomatic communications were conducted in formal...
Japanese is also a notoriously difficult language. The number of different variations for very, very similar kanji are incredibly expansive. So the same sentence could be read many different ways, especially if they are not a native Japanese speaker trying to break that down. I do not know any Japanese, but it is a fairly well-known piece that Japanese is one of those more complicated languages when it comes to translations or to understanding. And that's going to be a problem.
Japanese, the resulting translations, while substantively accurate, appeared harsher and more demanding than the originals. Translators also inserted and removed words and phrases, making it appear like there was no room to maneuver, with basic errors like substituting the phrase "final concessions" with the more provocative "ultimatum." Seriously, you put these things side by side, and it is pretty glaring.
Alright, let's see here. The original stated the present negotiations are our final effort, and the security of the empire depends on it. Whereas the translated version from the Magic Group, from the translators, was the present negotiations are our final effort. In fact, we gambled the fate of our land on the throw of this die is a wild shift. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. And I do, to be fair, I doubt that this was any kind of malicious piece. This was probably more a case of them being understaffed and underfunded. They probably needed to get these things done quickly. They probably didn't have the proper training to get specifically formal Japanese translated correctly. And this is probably just a horrifically bad error that led to this breakdown in translation.
Hull was also, by this time, simply disinclined to believe anything Japan said. Its horrifying massacres in China and obvious preparations to invade Southeast Asia, confirmed again by the Purple Intercepts, meant that despite his friendship with Nomura, he considered the negotiations untrustworthy. Not to mention, Hull also disliked Kurusu, seeing him as a Nazi ally, since he'd signed the Tripartite Act on behalf of Japan. So Hull and Roosevelt slow-walked their response to Proposition B, considering it carefully, as they also tracked Japanese forces moving into position outside of Hong Kong, in Indochina, and in ports across Japan. Purple intercepts and phone taps made it clear that Japan was talking peace, but preparing for war. To them, it appeared Japan was using diplomacy to stall their way to a better military position, and they were right. Secrecy around the Pearl Harbor attacks was incredibly tight, and the cabinet had specifically agreed to keep diplomats like Nomura and Kurusu out of the loop to make the bluff more convincing.
And this kind of goes to what we've discussed before, the fact that the military and civilian governments just were not communicating, were not working together. And that makes all this much worse. What happened when the Japanese made a deal with the French to not invade French Indochina? They then immediately invaded French Indochina. It's such a problem. The Japanese had numerous times made deals with China and promised to keep troops out of China proper, and the military still went in. And when Japan was trying to work out a deal with the Soviets, Japanese military officers started a skirmish on the border. Like I said before, the military's actions and the actions of the militarists are making Japan just seem incredibly untrustworthy. And it makes sense that Hull and Washington and other leaders in Washington would just not trust anything that's coming out of the Japanese government at this point.
Ensign Yoshikawa, the spy embedded in the Honolulu consulate from the episode earlier, didn't actually know either. He only knew he was supposed to pump drunk Marines for information and to skin dive at night in the harbor channel looking for submarine nets. Increasingly, he was told to create a grid map of the harbor and cable what ships were berthed in which sections. It was clear to intelligence groups, both in the US and Britain, that Japanese forces were preparing to hit something, but what? Singapore? The Philippines? The Dutch East Indies, maybe? Perhaps some combination. That last...
By the way, the answer is all of it. All of it. They are going to have such a major series. Over the course of about 6 months, they are going to hit everything in Southeast Asia. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, all of it is going to get slammed by Japanese forces over the next several months. And they have kind of consistently prepped for this massive movement. Matter of fact, they had plans to invade Australia, but thankfully the Japanese fleet that was set to do that eventually was damaged heavily enough at the Battle of the Coral Sea that they were never able to actually initiate that invasion.
The last one seemed the most likely. And for months, British and Dutch diplomats had begged Roosevelt for even a verbal agreement that the three powers would fight together should they be attacked. But still, Hull and Roosevelt remained evasive. An agreement was premature. They were still negotiating with Japan. However, they did send out an alert to U.S. forces in the Philippines, Midway, Wake, and Hawaii that a conflict might be coming. However, this warning was so vague that individual commanders interpreted it in wildly different ways. In the Philippines, it was seen as a caution that ships might strike Singapore, in which case America may need to provide air support. While at Pearl Harbor, it was seen as a warning of possible sabotage.
Which is going to be a disastrous thing. The defenders, the commanders at Pearl Harbor are going to actually condense their planes on the runways and in the hangars so they would be easier to watch, to prevent sabotage. And that means when the Japanese actually arrive and start shooting and start strafing the runways, hitting it with bombs, it's going to be much easier to destroy pretty much the entire American air fleet at Pearl Harbor before they ever get off the ground.
By the local Japanese-American population. An air commander responded by grouping planes close together on the runway where they were easier to guard and easier to bomb. But no one in the Roosevelt administration, apart from a few outliers, truly considered Pearl a target for a Japanese strike.
It's such an outlier. It's so far from the Japanese mainland that realistically it shouldn't have been. A Japanese fleet fully prepped and fully prepared could realistically make it to Hawaii, have very minimal extra fuel to idle and stay long enough for the attack, and then get back to friendly harbors before having major supply issues. So it seems like an insane gamble that they would actually go out and attack Pearl Harbor. It seemed like these plans around Pearl Harbor were likely a later possibility once that the war had actually gotten underway and they had moved closer to American territory, possibly after taking territories like Guam or Wake Island, like I previously mentioned, and building resupply stations there. So it's really, it makes a lot of sense to go, the Philippines are an obvious target. Guam is an obvious target. Pearl Harbor, that'd be insane for them to go after.
To do it, the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to sail far north into freezing waters before turning down into the mid-Pacific tropics. They'd risk exposure if they were spotted by even a single merchant ship, aircraft, or PBY Catalina patrols out of Midway. And a surprise carrier-based air raid at such long range had never been done before.
Yep.
We assumed they had good sense, said one American commander after the war. Another admitted in racist terms that they simply didn't think the Japanese had the capability. Given the fleet movements, Roosevelt scrapped his more conciliatory counterproposal, and instead, he and Hull drew up a list of 10 hardball points, known as the Hull Note, including a full Japanese troop withdrawal from China and Indochina, abandonment of the Tripartite Pact, and to cease supporting puppet governments in China.
Now this is probably the death nail. Realistically, Japan, a number of Japanese leaders, not Tojo, but a number of Japanese leaders wanted to find an out for the quagmire in China. It was at this point, years-long slog that had killed so many young Japanese men, as well as millions of Chinese that had lost their lives at this point. But the loss of Manchuria, which was what would happen if the puppet governments were given up, and the loss of their allies in the form of Germany and Italy in the removal from the Tripartite Pact would more or less doom any chance of further expansion, which Japan was not willing to take that at the time.
Then, Japan could return to most favored nation status, and both countries would leave China. And they delivered that to Nomura November 26th. On December 2nd, an undetected fleet under Admiral Nagumo, already a third of its way to Hawaii, received a coded message from Yamamoto. Climb Mount Nidaka. The code that diplomacy had failed, and that the attack would begin.
That is a big deal. And it makes sense at that point. We kind of pointed that out. We just discussed the reasons why they definitely wouldn't want that as their case, as what would actually happen. So it makes sense that they want to send out, or they're going to send out that notice. The next one is the episode on the actual attack itself, the Day of Infamy. I am curious. They haven't discussed at all the preparations to do this, because Pearl Harbor is a rather shallow harbor, and there is a whole fascinating story behind the creation of specialized torpedo rudders to manage and work with that shallow harbor environment. So we'll see if they go over that at the next one. I'm assuming that it's mostly going to be just focused on the actual attack itself. So we'll see you in the next one. We're almost done. Have a great day, and go watch the original. Bye.